All right, well, hello everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. I'm Mark Jesus, a digital accessibility specialist here at AWeb, and today we'll be diving into the topic of color and accessibility. So color contrast is a fundamental component in web accessibility. It affects how clearly users can perceive text or UI components on a page. When contrast is insufficient, users with low vision or color vision deficiencies may struggle to read or understand the color of the content, which can impact the overall usability of your site or application. For web interfaces, WCAG outlines that all meaningful text, symbols, and interactive components must meet contrast requirements. This includes components in different interactive states, such as when they're in focused, hovered over, or selected. Each of these states should have sufficient contrast so users can perceive them clearly. Some different types of text are important to consider here. So things like placeholder text, which often appears faded in input fields, should still reach contrast requirements. Tooltip text, which can usually be smaller and potentially less visible, should still reach contrast requirements. And error messages. They especially need to be clear and reach contrast requirements as they communicate critical information to users. An exception to WCAG contrast requirements is for disabled components. Since these components are interactive, they will have a lower contrast. The intent here is to visually indicate that the element is disabled and unusable. So on the slide here, I have a screenshot of our color contrast checker. This tool is used to check whether or not color combinations pass conformance. You can use our tool in several different methods. First, you can enter a hex color code to select the foreground or background color. The second method would be to use the color selector tool or the eyedropper in the color input element. So typically when using the eyedropper, you'd want to try to select the darkest possible pixel out of the component or the text to grab the color. And then below the color selectors is a WCAG compliance information chart, which will tell you if the selected color passes conformance. And this will be seen in the next slide here. So text contrast and text contrast hover focus. Normal text must reach a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 against the background. Large text or bold must reach a contrast ratio of at least 3 to 1 against the background. If the hover focus state changes, such as changes text color, such as for links, then the text must retain a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio as well. So here we have several screenshots of text contrast failures and text contrast that are compliant with the appropriate contrast requirements. So below the first column for normal text is an image of 3 text components outlined in red by our automated scanner tool, which detected that they are failing the required contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 against the background. Below that image, we can see the WCAG compliance information chart that I mentioned, showing that the white text on the turquoise background only reaches a 3.01 to 1, which is not sufficient. And then below that image is another text component, add website, and with white text on a dark blue background that is passing the 4.5 to 1 contrast requirement. And then here we have a second column for large text, and the text says eat beats outlined in red, again by our automated scanner tool, as it was detected that the text fails to reach the large text contrast requirements, since the text only reaches a 2.41 to 1 contrast ratio instead of the 3.1 contrast requirement. Below that image is a large text in black, the first steps in ADA compliance, on a blue background that reaches a 3 to 1 contrast requirement. For non-text contrast and UI components or graphics, visual information used to identify UI components, so things like input borders, button shape outlines, etc., must have a contrast ratio of 3 to 1 against the background, or there must be a contrasting indicator present. Graphical objects, so in other words, things like standalone icons, such as a print icon with no text, and the important parts of a more complex diagram, such as each line in a graph or the contents of an infographic, must reach a contrast ratio of 3 to 1 for parts of graphics you need to understand the content. So here we have multiple examples of failing UI components and input borders. So the examples here share similar foreground and background colors, which is the light gray border or button outline on a white background, which is a very common color pattern that typically fails to reach the 3 to 1 UI component contrast requirement. This can be tested using the Accessible Web contrast checker using the dropper as mentioned previously to find the darkest possible pixel of the border or button outline and testing that light gray against the white background. Below the failing examples are 2 screenshots of passing examples taken from our RAMP platform. The first is a screenshot of a search input with a passing dark gray input border, a dark gray placeholder text, as well as a dark gray search text component. And below that screenshot are several UI components of a dark mode button, a get help button, and notification link, which all pass the 3 to 1 contrast requirement as well. So for non-text contrast states, When elements have a visual indication of what state they're in, so whether it's focus for tab, mouse over and hover, or selected, the visual indication must meet a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against the background. But this rule can be ignored for elements where the focus state is dictated by the default browser behavior. So we recommend using the native browser focus indication when possible. The examples shown on this page are taken from our ramp platform. The try ramp for free button receives a blue outline, and the internal text flips colors from the default blue text on a white background to white text on a blue background when this component receives focus. And below that is an example of a search component. This component receives a blue outline and also has a vertical blinking bar in the input field. This indicates where the next characters will be inserted. The blinking behavior can also serve as a visual cue to users, signaling that the field is active and ready for input. So for use of color, color cannot be used as the only visual means of conveying information, indicating an action, or prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. This example on this page shows a common use of color issue. When form inputs aren't correctly filled out, only the color red is used to indicate an error. So below you'll find an example that doesn't rely solely on color alone to convey an error. In this example, the item causing the error is also clearly identified and described to the user with text. So using color to convey meaning can be great practice, it just can't be used alone. We should also visually convey the information in a way that does not rely on color perception. So for graphical elements such as charts or graphs, we can use patterns, icons, shapes, or text in addition to color to make them distinguishable or for everyone. So on this slide, we have a screenshot that was taken from our ramp platform again of a line graph showing a trend of issues. So this graph utilizes different shapes in addition to color to distinguish the different severity levels. So for example, here you can see that the critical severity level is represented by the square shape in addition to the color red. And if a change in color is used to indicate that a component has focus, there must be a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 between the default and focus states of that component. Or if a color is the only way to differentiate links from regular text, we want that link color to meet a 3:1 contrast ratio against the surrounding text. So an example here, the text cola is a link and its link color is blue and it's surrounded by black text. So although that it passes the use of color criteria because it reaches a 3:1 contrast ratio against the surrounding black text, the blue text by itself actually fails to reach the 4.5:1 contrast ratio against the white background. So we just want to ensure that the text elements still reach the appropriate contrast requirements regardless of the use of color failure as well. So how can we help you? So our guided audit tool can identify and outline the color contrast requirements that failed to reach the contrast requirements. So if a page contains various indifferentiating colors for text contrast or non-text contrast related content, it may be beneficial to explore our consulting services and accessibility audits. An accessibility specialist can help ensure links are distinguished from surrounding text in a way that does not rely on color alone and ensure that contrast between foreground and background colors meet WCAG minimum contrast thresholds. Additionally, we provide VPATs to document whether all contrast-related content on your site complies with accessibility standards. So thank you all for taking the time to join us for this webinar. I'm just going to open up the floor for an open discussion, and you can ask any questions about this webinar or